John C. Maxwell, Failing Forward, Turning Mistakes into Stepping Stones for Success. Read by Terry Tyler. Preface: Becoming a Real Success. As I speak around the country, people often ask me why I write books. I've been asked that question so many times that I want to give you the answer before you begin reading the first chapter of Failing Forward. I have dedicated my life to adding value to people. It's the reason I teach conferences, record lessons on cassette, create training videos, and write books. It's the reason I lead my organization, the Enjoy Group. I want to see people achieve. I want to see each person I meet become a real success. I believe that to succeed, a person needs only 4 things. You can remember them by thinking of the word real. Relationships, equipping, attitude, and leadership. Relationships. The greatest skill needed for success is the ability to get along with other people. It impacts every aspect of a person's life. Your relationships make you or they break you. Equipping. One of the most significant lessons I've learned is that those closest to you determine the level of your success. If your dreams are great, you only achieve them with a team. Attitude. People's attitudes often determine how they approach life day to day. Your attitude, more than your aptitude, will determine your altitude. Leadership. Everything rises and falls on leadership. If you desire to lift the lid on your personal effectiveness, the only way to do it is to increase your leadership skills. If you pick up any one of my books, you can be sure that it seeks to add value in one of these 4 areas. I've written this particular book to change your attitude about failure. Read it, absorb it, and allow it to help you turn your mistakes into stepping stones for success. My desire is that Failing Forward will add value to your life. 1. What's the main difference between people who achieve and people who are average? We are all failures, at least all the best of us are. J. M. Barrie. What makes achievers excel? Why do some people skyrocket while others plummet? You know what I'm talking about. You can call it luck, blessings, or the Midas touch. Call it whatever you want. But the truth is that some people just seem to achieve incredible things in spite of tremendous difficulties. They finish in the top 5% in nationwide sales for their company after losing key accounts. They find ingenious ways to increase profits for their department in the face of budget cuts. They earn a graduate degree while raising 2 children as a single parent. They discover awesome business opportunities while colleagues don't see any at all. Or they recruit winner after winner into their organization, despite what looks like an anemic labor pool. It doesn't matter what kind of work they do. Wherever they are, they just seem to make things happen. Certainly, all people like to think of themselves as above average, but achievers seem to leave average in the dust, so far behind them that ordinary seems a distant memory. What's in the root of achievement? What makes the difference? Why do some people achieve so much? Is it family background? Having a good family growing up is something to be grateful for, but it's not a reliable indicator of achievement. High percentages of successful people come from broken homes. Wealth? No. Some of the greatest achievers come from households of average to below average means. Wealth is no indicator of high achievement, and poverty is no guarantee of low achievement. Opportunity? Opportunity is a peculiar thing. 2 people with similar gifts talents, and resources can look in a situation, and one person will see tremendous opportunity while the other sees nothing. Opportunity is in the eye of the beholder. High morals? I wish that were the key, but it's not. I've known people with high integrity who achieve little, and I've known scoundrels who are high producers. Haven't you? The absence of hardship. For every achiever who has avoided tragedy, there is a Helen Keller who overcame extreme disabilities, or a Viktor Frankl who survived absolute horrors. That's not to say it either. No, none of these things are the key when it comes right down to it. I know of only one factor that separates those who consistently shine from those who don't. The difference between average people and achieving people is their perception of and response to failure. Nothing else has the same kind of impact on people's ability to achieve and to accomplish whatever their minds and hearts desire. What you never learned in school. Soccer player Kyle Rote Jr. remarked, "There is no doubt in my mind that there are many ways to be a winner. But there is really only one way to be a loser, and that is to fail and not look behind the failure." How people see failure and deal with it, whether they possess the ability to look beyond it and keep achieving, impacts every aspect of their lives. Yet that ability seems difficult to acquire. Most people don't know where to start looking at it. There is no doubt in my mind that there are many ways to be a winner, but there is really only one way to be a loser, and that is to fail and not look beyond the failure. Kyle Rote Jr. Even positive people have a tough time learning how to see failure positively. For example, I'm known to be a very positive person. My book, The Winning Attitude, has been in print for more than 15 years. But I haven't always been good at failing forward. I wasn't properly prepared for it, and it's certainly not something they tried to teach me in school. And kids today don't get it there either. In fact, the school environment often reinforces people's worst feelings and expectations about the failure. Take a look at some of my previous attitudes towards failure and see if your experience was similar. 1. I feared failure. An experience I had in college, along with my response to it, is typical of what many students encounter. On the first day of class when I was a freshman, the professor walked into my History of Civilization class and boldly declared, "Half of you in this room will not pass this class." What was my first response? Fear. Up until that time, I had never failed a class, and I did not want to start failing all of a sudden. So the first question I asked myself was, what does the professor want? School became a game that I wanted to win. I recall that I once memorized 83 dates for a test in that class because my teacher believed that if you could cite the dates, you had mastered the material. I got an A on the test, but 3 days later, I had forgotten all of the information. I managed to avoid the failure I had feared, but I had not really accomplished anything. 2. I misunderstood failure. What is failure? As a child, I thought it was percentage. 69 and lower meant failure. 70 above signified success. That thinking didn't help me. Failure isn't a percentage or a test. It's not a single event, it is a process. 3. I was unprepared for failure. When I graduated from college with my bachelor's degree, I finished in the top 5% of my class. It didn't mean a thing. I had played the school game successfully, and I had absorbed a lot of information, but I wasn't at all prepared for what was ahead of me. I found that out in my first job as the pastor in a small rural church. I worked very hard that first year. I did everything the people might expect of me and then some. But, to be honest, I was as concerned about getting everyone to like me as I was with helping people. In the type of church I led, each year the people voted to decide whether to allow the leader to keep his job. And many of the leaders I knew over the years loved to brag about the unanimous affirming votes they received from their people. My expectations were high as I prepared to receive my first unanimous vote. Imagine my surprise when the votes came back 31 yeses, 1 no, and 1 abstention. I was devastated. After I went home that night, I called my father, who was a veteran pastor, former superintendent in the denomination, and college president. "Dad," I lamented, "I can't believe it. I worked so hard for these people. I've done everything I can." I was at the point of tears. Somebody actually voted against me and wanted me to leave the church. To my shock, I heard laughter on the other end of the phone. "No, son, stay there," my dad said as he chuckled. "That's probably the best vote you'll ever receive." Break. Do you enjoy books like this? Purchase Facing the Storm, Unlimited Motivation by Terry Tyler on the Amazon bookstore or the Kindle library. End break. A new course. At that moment, I realized what an unrealistic view I had of success and failure. If anything, my college experience had reinforced the wrong notions I had about failure. And as I've helped leaders to grow and develop through the years, I've seen that most people are in the same boat. In Leadership magazine, J. Wallace Hamilton states, "The increase of suicides, alcoholics, and even forms of nervous breakdowns are evidence that many people are training for success when they should be training for failure. Failure is far more common than success. Poverty is way more prevalent than wealth, and disappointment more normal than arrival. Training for failure. That is a great concept, and it's the idea that prompted me to write this book. Right now, you're getting the chance to sign up with me for a class you were never offered in school. I want to help you train for failure. I want you to learn how to confidently look at the prospect of failure in the eye and move forward anyway. Because in life, the question is not if you have problems, but how are you going to deal with the problems? Are you going to fail forward or backward? Putting a new face on obstacles. When I think of people who are able to look trouble in the eye and forge ahead, one of the first who comes to mind is Mary Kay Ash. She has built quite an organization. During the last 4 or 5 years, I've had many opportunities to speak to the people in her cosmetics company about leadership. In fact, I travel around the country doing conferences and seminars. It seems that no matter where I speak, there are always at least a dozen Mary Kay consultants in attendance. I admire Mary Kay. She overcame a lot of obstacles in her career, and she never let failure get the better of her. Mary Kay's first career was in direct sales, and she was quite successful. But she also found that it was difficult for a woman to progress in the corporate world, especially in the 1950s and early 1960s. Even after 25 years of success, she says, "I had worked my way up to being a member of the board of the company I was with, only to find that, even though our sales force was entirely made up of women, governed by an all-male board, my opinions were of no value. I constantly heard, 'Mary Kay, You are thinking like a woman again. I felt rejection in the worst form, so I decided to retire. Her retirement didn't last long. By the time a month passed, she was going stir-crazy. She was ready to start her own business. If she was going to encounter obstacles, they would be there only because she brought them on herself. She decided on a cosmetics business that she would give every woman who worked in it unlimited opportunities. She purchased the formulas to the best beauty products she'd ever found, worked up a marketing plan, and prepared to set up a corporation. Trouble. It didn't take long for her to hit the first obstacle. When she visited her attorney to make legal arrangements for the corporation, he insulted her and predicted her failure. "Mary Kay," he said, "if you are going to throw away your life savings, why don't you just go directly to the trash can? It would be so much easier than what you are proposing." Her accountant spoke to her in similar terms. Despite their attempts to discourage her, she moved ahead. She sank her $5,000 life savings into her new business, every cent she had. She put her husband in charge of the administrative side of things as she worked feverishly to prepare the products, design the packaging, write the training materials, and recruit consultants. They were making wonderful progress, but then, a month before she was open for business, her husband died of a heart attack right there at the kitchen table. Most people would have never been able to go on after that. They would have accepted defeat and faded away. But not Mary Kay. She kept going, and on September 13th, 1963, she launched her business. Today, the company has more than $1 billion in annual sales, employs 3,500 people, and empowers 500,000 direct sales consultants in 26 markets worldwide. And Mary Kay Ash has just received about every entrepreneur award one could dream of. Despite adverse circumstances, obstacles, and hardships, she failed forward. If your perception of and response to failure were changed, what would you do to attempt to achieve? The impossible question. When I was growing up, one of the questions I used to hear from motivational speakers was this: if the possibility of failure were erased, what would you attempt to achieve? That seemed to me to be an intriguing question. At the time, it prompted me to look ahead at life's possibilities. But then one day I realized that it was a really bad question. Why? Because it takes a person's thinking down the wrong track. There is no achievement without failure. To even imply that it might be possible gives people the wrong impression. So, here's a better question. If your perception of and response to failure were changed, what would you attempt to achieve? I don't know what obstacles you are facing in your life right now, but whatever they are, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that your life can change if you're willing to look at failure differently. You have the potential to overcome any problems, mistakes, or misfortune. All you have to do is learn to fail forward. If you are ready to do that, turn the page and let's go. Your first step to failing forward. Realize there is one major difference between average people and achieving people. Look at the way any achiever approaches negative experiences, and you can learn a lot about how to fail forward. Read through these two lists and determine which one describes your approach to failure. Failing backwards, blaming others, repeating the same mistakes, expecting never to fail again, expecting to continually fail, accepting tradition blindly, being limited by past mistakes, thinking I am a failure, quitting, failing forward, taking responsibility, learning from each mistake, knowing failure is a part of progress, maintaining a positive attitude, challenging outdated assumptions, taking new risks, believing something didn't work, persevering. Think about a recent setback you experienced. How did you respond? No matter how difficult your problems were, the key to overcoming them doesn't lie in changing your circumstances, it's in changing yourself. That, in itself, is a process, and it begins with a desire to be teachable. If you're willing to do that, then you'll be able to handle failure. From this moment on, make a commitment to do whatever it takes to fail forward. Step to failing forward. Realize there is one major difference between average people and achieving people. Redefining failure and success. 2. Get a new definition of failure and success. The difference between greatness and mediocrity is often how an individual views a mistake. Nelson Boswell. On August 6, 1999, a Major League Baseball player stepped up to home plate in Montreal and made another out, the 5,113th of his professional career. That's a lot of trips to the batter's box without a hit. If a player made all of those outs consecutively, and he averaged 4 bats a game, he would play 8 seasons, 1,278 games straight, without ever reaching first base. Was the player discouraged that night? No. Did he think he had failed himself or the team? No. You see, earlier in the game, in his first plate appearance, that player had reached a milestone that only 21 other people in the history of baseball had ever achieved. He had made his 3,000th hit. That player was Tony Gwynn of the San Diego Padres. During that game, Tony got on base with 4 hits, 4 times in 5 tries, but that's not the norm for him. He usually fails to get a hit 2 times out of every 3 attempts. Those results may not sound very encouraging, but if you know baseball, you know that Tony's ability to succeed consistently only 1 time in 3 tries has made him the greatest hitter of his generation. And Tony recognizes that to get his hits, he has to make a lot of outs. I've been with Tony Gwynn fan for more than a decade. When I lived in San Diego, I had season tickets to the Padres game. I saw him play in his first game there, and I've continued to follow his career closely. As he approached hit number 3,000, I knew I wanted to be at the game when he achieved that feat. On the day he was expected to achieve that milestone, I had just finished teaching in leadership at a conference in Chicago, and I was to be speaking in Philadelphia the next day. I scrambled to change my plane tickets, then called my son-in-law, Steve, who was going to be at the next conference with me, to invite him along, and each of us hopped a plane to Montreal for the game. As I traveled, I knew our schedule would be tight, but I figured we could make it. When we arrived at the airport, everything looked great. But after getting off the plane, Steve got tied up in customs. With the clock ticking away, I was pretty sure that we were going to miss Tony's first at-bat, and was sure by the time we reached the stadium, he had only batted and hit 3,000. How do you define failure? One of the greatest problems people have with failure is that they are too quick to judge isolated situations in their lives and label them as failures. Instead, they need to keep the bigger picture in mind. When we realized that we were probably going to miss Tony's historic moment, did we give up? When we got to the stadium and knew we had missed it, did we turn around and go home? No. Did I think I had failed when I tried to buy a program, but learned the vendors had already sold out of them? No. You see, we were just glad to be a part of the celebration. And like Tony, who keeps hanging in there until he gets his hits, we were rewarded. Late in the game, when Tony hit a foul ball into the stands, I got it. A few weeks later, Tony signed the ball for me. I have a souvenir from his 3,000 hit game. One of the greatest problems people have with failure is that they are too quick to judge isolated situations in their lives and label them as failures. Instead, they needed to keep the bigger picture in mind. Sometimes, like Tony Gwynn doesn't look out and makes them think of failure. He sees it within the context of the bigger picture. His perspective leads to perseverance. His perseverance brings longevity, and his longevity gives him opportunities for success. Failure is not. Changing your perspective on failure will help you to persevere and ultimately achieve your desires. So, how should you judge failure? Let's start by taking a look at 7 things failure is not. 1. People think failure is unavoidable or is avoidable. It's not. Everybody fails, errs, and makes mistakes. You've heard the saying, to err is human, to forgive divine. Alexander Pope wrote that more than 250 years ago, and he was only paraphrasing his sayings that was common to 2,000 years ago during the time of the Romans. Today, things are the same as they were then. If you're a human being, you're going to make mistakes. You're probably familiar with Murphy's Law and the Peter Principle. Recently, I came across something called Rules for Being Human. I think the list describes the state we're living in as people. Rule number 1, you will learn lessons. Rule number 2, there are no mistakes, only lessons. Rule number 3, a lesson is repeated until it is learned. Rule number 4, if you don't learn the easy lessons, they get harder. Pain is one way the universe gets your attention. Rule number 5, you'll know you've learned a lesson when your actions change. You see, Norman Cousins was right when he said, the essence of man is imperfection, knowing that you're going to make mistakes. 2, people think failure is an event. It's not. Growing up, I thought that failure came in a moment. The best example I can think of is taking a test. If you got an F, it meant you failed. But I've come to realize that failure is a process. If you flunk a test, it doesn't mean you failed a one-time event. The F shows that you neglected the process leading up to the test. In 1997, I wrote a book called The Success Journey. It offers an overview on what it means to be successful. In it, I define success in these terms: knowing your purpose in life, growing to reach your potential, sowing seeds that benefit others. The thesis of the book is that success is not a destination. It's not a place where you arrive one day. Instead, it is the journey you take. And whether you succeed comes on what you do day to day. In other words, success is a process. Failure works the same way. It's not some place you arrive. Just as success is not an event, neither is failure. It's how you deal with life along the way. No one can conclude that he has failed until he breathes his last breath. Until then, he's still in the process and the jury is still out. 3, people think failure is objective. It's not. When you err, whether you miscalculate crucial figures, miss a deadline, blow a deal, make a poor choice concerning your children, or otherwise fumble a ball, what determines whether that action was a failure? Do you look at the size of the problem it causes or the amount of money it costs you and your organization? Is it determined by how much heat you have to take from your boss or the criticism of your peers? No, failure isn't determined that way. The answer is that you are the only person who can really label what you do a failure. It is subjective. Your perception of and response to your mistakes determine whether your actions are failures. Did you know that entrepreneurs almost never get their first business off the ground, or their second, or their third? According to Tulane University business professor Lisa Amos, the average for entrepreneurs is 3.8 failures before they finally make it in business. They are not deterred by problems, mistakes, or errors. Why? Because they don't see setbacks as failures. They recognize that 3 steps forward and 2 steps back still equals 1 step forward. And as a result, they overcame the average and became achievers. 4. People think failure is the enemy. It's not. Most people try to avoid failure like the plague. They're afraid of it. But it takes adversity to create success. NBA coach Rick Pitino states that it more strongly. Failure's good, he says. It's fertilizer. Everything I've learned about coaching, I've learned from making mistakes. People who see failure as the enemy are captive to those who conquer it. Herbert V. Brocknow believes, the fellow who never makes mistakes takes his order from one who does. Observe any high achiever and you'll discover a person who doesn't see a mistake as the enemy. That's true in any endeavor. Musicologist Eloise Ristad emphasizes that when we give ourselves permission to fail, we, at the same time, give ourselves permission to excel. Break. Would you like to excel? Get a social media package at www.midsouthmedia.net. Would you like to advertise? Click in the comments below to get your advertisement featured on the audiobook. Break. 5. People think failure is irreversible. It's not. There's an old saying in Texas, it doesn't matter how much milk you spill as long as you don't lose your cow. In other words, mistakes are not irreversible. Keep everything in perspective. The problems come when you see only the spilt milk and not the bigger picture. People who correctly see failure take it in stride. Mistakes don't make them want to give up. Success doesn't make them think that they are set up. Every event, whether good or bad, is one small step in the process of living, or, as Tom Peters acknowledges, if silly things were not done, intelligent things would never happen. 6. People think failure is a stigma. It's not. Mistakes are not permanent markers. I love the perspective of late Senator Sam Ervin Jr., who remarked, defeat may serve as well as victory to shake the soul and let the glory out. That's the way we need to look at failure. When you make mistakes, don't let them get you down, and don't let yourself think of them as stigmas. Make each failure a step to success. The average for entrepreneurs is 3.8 failures before they finally make it in business. 7. People think failure is final. It's not. Even what may appear to be a huge failure doesn't need to keep you from achieving. Consider the story of Sergio Zyman. He was the mastermind behind New Coke, something that marketing consultant Robert McMath sees as one of the greatest project failures of all time. Zyman, who successfully introduced Diet Coke, believed that Coca-Cola needed to act boldly, to reverse its 20-year marketing decline against the rival Pepsi. His solution was to stop offering the drink that had been popular for nearly 100 years, change the formula, and offer it as New Coke. The move was an abysmal failure that lasted 79 days in 1985 and cost the company about $100 million. People hated New Coke, and it caused Zyman to leave the company. But Zyman's problems with New Coke didn't keep him down. Years later, when asked if the venture was a mistake, Zyman answers, "No," categorically. A failure? No. A blunder, a misstep, a bust? Another word between bust and something else, he replies. Now, if you say to me, the strategy that you guys embarked on didn't work, I'll say, yeah, it obviously did not work, but the totality of the action ended up being positive. Ultimately, the return of Coca-Cola Classic made the company stronger. Simon's assessment was confirmed by Roberto Goizueta, the late chairman and chief executive of the Coca-Cola Company. He rehired Zyman at Coca-Cola in 1993. "Judge the results," said Goizueta. "We get paid to produce results. We don't get paid to be right." It's all in how you look at it. Steps to success. Afraid of being a fool. Looks like a fool. Fool. Successful entrepreneur. Genius. If you tend to focus on the extremes of success and failure, and to fixate on particular events in your life, try to put things into perspective. When you do, you'll be able to share the philosophy of someone such as the Apostle Paul, who was able to say, "I have learned in whatever state I am to be content." And that was saying a lot, considering that Paul had been shipwrecked, whipped, beaten, stoned, and imprisoned. Throughout everything, his faith enabled him to maintain perspective. He realized that as long as he was doing what he was supposed to do, his being labeled success or failures by others really didn't even matter. Every person's life is filled with errors and negative experiences. But know this: errors become mistakes when we perceive them and respond to them incorrectly. Mistakes become failures when we continually respond to them incorrectly. People who fail forward are able to see errors or negative experiences as a part of life, learn from them, and move on. They persevere in order to achieve their purpose in life. Washington Irving once commented, "Great minds have purposes, others have wishes. Little minds are subdued by misfortunes, but great minds rise above them." The terrible truth is that all roads to achievement lead through the land of failure. It has stood firmly that between every human being who led a dream and the realization of that dream, the good news is that anyone can make it through failure. That's why Rob Parsons maintained that tomorrow belongs to the failures. Too many people believe that the process is supposed to be easy. The prolific American inventor Thomas Edison observed that attitude among people, and this is how he responded to it. Failure is really a matter of conceit. People don't work hard because, in their conceit, they will imagine they'll succeed without ever making an effort. Most people believe that they'll wake up someday and find themselves rich. They've actually got it half right because eventually they do wake up. Each of us has to make a choice. Are we going to sleep life away, avoiding failure at all costs? Or are we going to wake up and realize this? Failure is simply a price we pay to achieve success. If we learn to embrace that new definition of failure, then we are free to start moving ahead. and failing forward. Errors become mistakes when we perceive them and respond to them incorrectly. Mistakes become failures when we respond to them incorrectly continually. Moving forward on the heels of tragedy. Over dinner, I heard a great story about the price someone paid to achieve success. It all started when I arranged for two friends to meet. Last year, when speaking for Aunt Annie's Pretzels, I was talking to Annie Baylor, the company's founder. As we talked, she mentioned in passing that one of her heroes is Truett Cathy, the founder of the Chick-fil-A restaurant team. Would you like to meet him? I asked. You know him? Anne responded, a little surprised. I sure do, I answered. When we moved to my company, Enjoy Group, to Atlanta in 1997, Truett and his son, Dan Cathy, took all of us under their wings. They're wonderful friends, and I'll arrange for all of us to have dinner together. I immediately set a date, and soon afterward my wife, Margaret, and I had Truett Cathy, Ann and Jonas Beeler, and Dan and Rhonda Cathy over to dinner. We had a wonderful time. I was amazed as Ann and Dan, who is the president of Chick-fil-A International, openly exchanged trade information about their business. I was pleased because I could tell they were enjoying a good connection. But the highlight of the evening for me was hearing Truett Cathy tell the story of his start in the restaurant business and how that led to the founding of Chick-fil-A. How it all began. Truett's description of his childhood activities showed me that he was a born entrepreneur. As a second grader, he discovered that he could buy a six-pack of Cokes for $0.25 and sell them for $0.05 apiece and make a 20% profit. It wasn't long before he was buying soft drinks by the case, icing them down and increasing his revenue and profit. When the weather turned cold and drink sales lagged, he sold magazines. Then, at age 11, he started helping a neighbor with his paper route. By age 12, he had his own route. Like many young men of his era, Truett went into the Army. When he was discharged in 1945, he was ready to pursue opportunity. What appealed to him was a restaurant, and his dream was to work with Ben, one of his brothers. After learning a little bit about the business, they scraped together some money, located a site, built a restaurant, and opened the Dwarf Grill. Later, the Dwarf House in Hapeville, Georgia, on the south side of Atlanta. It was open 24 hours, 6 days a week, and through it required an incredible amount of work. It was profitable from the first week, but it wouldn't be long before Truett faced the first of several major setbacks. Tragic losses. The first came early, only 3 years after opening the restaurant. Truett's two brothers were in a small private plane that crashed on the way to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Both of them died. Losing a business partner is tough. Losing both brothers was horrible. Truett was devastated. Once he got over the emotional shock, he went on alone. A year later, he paid Eunice, his brother Ben's widow, for her share in the business. A year after that, he opened a second restaurant. By then, things were going pretty well. Then one night, he was awakened by a phone call. There was a fire at the second restaurant. He dashed over to see what could be done, but when he arrived, he discovered that the fire had totally destroyed the operation. That alone was bad enough. Worse was the fact that he had practically no insurance. Within a few weeks, Truett faced another debilitating setback. He discovered that he had polyps in his colon that needed to be removed. The timing couldn't be worse. Instead of rebuilding his restaurant, he went in for surgery. One operation turned into two, and much to his dismay, he was out of action for several months. An eternity for an energetic businessman like him. Turning lemons into lemonade and chicken sandwiches. What does an active entrepreneur do when he's stuck in bed for months at a time? If he's Truett Cathy, he comes up with $1 million idea. The time Truett spent out of commission inspired him to play with new concept. He had always loved chicken. It had been an important part of the Dwarf House fare. For a while, the restaurant had offered a boneless chicken breast on its menu. What would happen, he wondered, if I took that chicken breast, seasoned and fried it just right, and put it on a bun with the right condiments? The answer became the Chick-fil-A sandwich and the start of one of the largest privately owned restaurant chains in the world. Today, Truett Cathy is credited with inventing the chicken sandwich in the fast food industry. Chick-fil-A operates more than 900 restaurants across the country and has a 200,000 square foot headquarters that sits on 73 acres just south of Atlanta. In the year 2000, it became a $1 billion company. It is one of the most successful operations in the restaurant business, selling millions of chicken sandwiches and countless gallons of its famous fresh squeezed lemonade. The business continues growing, yet it never would have come to pass if Truett Cathy had not experienced the setbacks he did. Maintain his perspective and realize that a few negative experiences don't make for failure. Thomas Edison believed many of life's failures are people who did not realize how close they were to success when they gave up. If you can change the way you see failure, you gain the strength to keep running the race. Get a new definition of failure. Regard it as the price you pay for progress. If you can do that, you will put yourself in a much better position to fail forward. Your second step to failing forward. Learn a new definition of failure. How can you help yourself learn a new definition of failure and develop a different perspective concerning failure and success? By making mistakes. Chuck Braun of Idea Connection Systems encourages trainees to think differently through the use of a mistake quota. He gives each student a quota of 30 mistakes to make for each training session. And if a student uses up all 30, he receives another 30. As a result, the students relax, think of mistakes in a whole new light, and begin learning. As you approach your next big project or assignment, give yourself a reasonable mistake quotient. How many mistakes should you expect to achieve? 20, 50, 90? Give yourself a quota and try to hit it before bringing the task to completion. Remember, mistakes don't define failure. They are merely the price of achievement on the success journey. Steps to failing forward. 1. Realize there is one major difference between average people and achieving people. 2. Learn a new definition of failure. 3. If you failed, are you a failure? Failure isn't so bad if it doesn't attack the heart. Success is all right if it doesn't go to the head. Grantland Rice. In an interview years ago, David Brinkley asked advised columnist Ann Landers what questions she most frequently receives from readers. Her answer, "What's wrong with me?" Landers' response reveals a lot about human nature. Many people wrestle with feelings of failure, and the most damaging doubts and feelings is one central question: am I a failure? And that's a problem because I believe it's nearly impossible for any person to believe he is a failure and fail forward at the same time. It seems that advised columnists such as Ann Landers and humor writers recognize that keeping a good perspective of yourself is important to overcoming adversity and making mistakes. The late Irma Bombeck, who wrote a widely syndicated weekly humor column until a few weeks before her death in 1996, had a firm grasp on what it meant to persevere and fail forward without taking failure too personally. From newspaper copy girl to Time magazine cover girl, Irma Bombeck traveled a road that was filled with adversity. Starting with her career, she was drawn to journalism early in her life. Her first job was a copy girl at the Dayton Journal-Herald when she was a teenager. But when she went off to college at Ohio University, a guidance counselor advised her, forget about writing. She refused. Later, she transferred to the University of Dayton and in 1949 graduated with a degree in English. Soon afterward, she began working as a writer for the obituary column and the women's page. That year, adversity carried her into personal life when she got married. One of her deepest desires was to become a mother, but much to her dismay, her doctors told her that she was incapable of having children. Did she give up and consider herself a failure? No. She and her husband explored the possibility of adoption, and they adopted a daughter. 2 years later, a surprised Irma was pregnant, but even that brought her more difficulties. In 4 years, she experienced 4 pregnancies, but only 2 of the babies survived. In 1964, Irma was able to convince the editor of a small neighborhood newspaper, the Kettering Oakwood Times, to let her write a weekly humor column. Despite the pitiful $3 per article she was paid, she kept writing, and that opened a door for her. The next year, she was offered the opportunity to write 3 times a week column for her old employer, the Dayton Journal-Herald. By 1967, her column was syndicated and carried by more than 900 newspapers. For slightly more than 30 years, Irma wrote her humor column. During that time, she published 15 books and was recognized as one of the 25 most influential women in America. Appeared frequently on the television show Good Morning America, was featured on the cover of Time magazine, received innumerable honors such as the American Cancer Society's Medal of Honor, and was awarded 15 honorary degrees. But during that span of time, Bombeck also experienced incredible troubles and trials, including breast cancer, a mastectomy, and kidney failure. She wasn't shy about sharing her perspectives on her life experiences. I speak at college commencements, and I tell everyone I'm up there and they're down there. Not because of my successes, but because of my failures. When I proceed to spin all of them off, a comedy record album that sold 2 copies in Beirut, a sitcom that lasted about as long as the donut in our house, a Broadway play that never saw Broadway, book signings where I attracted 2 people, one who wanted directions to the restroom and the other one who wanted to buy the desk. What you have to tell yourself is, I'm not a failure. I failed at doing something. There's a big difference. Personally and career-wise, it's been a corduroy road. I've burned babies, lost parents, had cancer, and worried over kids. The trick is to put it in all perspective, and that's what I do for a living. That point of view kept Irma Bombeck down to earth. She liked to refer to herself as a former homeroom mother and an obituary writer. It also kept her going in writing. Though the disappointments, the pain, the surgeries, and the deadly kidney dialysis until her death at age 69. Tell yourself, I am not a failure. I failed at doing something. There is a big difference. Every genius could have been a failure. Every successful person is someone who failed, yet never regarded himself as a failure. For example, Wolfgang Mozart, one of the most geniuses of musical composition, was told by Emperor Ferdinand that his opera, The Marriage of Figaro, was far too noisy and contained far too many notes. Artist Vincent van Gogh, whose paintings now set records for the sums they are bringing at auction, sold only one painting in his lifetime. Thomas Edison, the most prolific inventor in history, was considered unteachable as a youngster. And Albert Einstein, the greatest thinker of our time, was told by the Munich schoolmaster that he would never amount to much. All great achievers are given multiple reasons to believe they are failures, but in spite of that, they persevere. I think it's safe to say that all great achievers are given multiple reasons to believe they are failures, but in fact, they persevere. In the face of adversity, rejection, and failings, they continue believing in themselves and refuse to consider themselves as failures. Failing forward is not a false self-esteem. In the last 20 years, as educators in the United States have watched students' test scores plummet and their desire to learn decline, they have tried to find ways to reverse those trends. One popular theory states that the best ways to improve children's ability is to puff up the self-esteem. When educators observe that high achievers possess confidence, they theorize that if they had simply built self-esteem, competence would follow. But that approach has backfired on them. Researchers have found that simply building children's egos breed many negative traits: indifference to excellence, inability to overcome adversity, and aggressiveness towards people who criticize them. Now, I place high value on praising people, especially children. In fact, I believe that people live up to your level of expectations. But I also believe that you have to base your praise on truth. You don't make up nice things to say about each other. Here's the approach I use to encourage and lead others. Value people. Praise effort. Reward performance. I use that method with everyone. I even use a form of it with myself. When I'm working, I don't give myself a reward until after the job is done. When I approach a task or project, I give it my very best. And no matter what the results are, I have a clear conscience. I have no problem sleeping at night, and no matter where I fail or how many mistakes I make, I don't let it devalue my worth as a person. As the saying goes, God uses people who fail, because there aren't any other kind around. Like many people, you may have had a hard time maintaining a positive mindset and preventing yourself from feeling like a failure. But know this, it is possible to cultivate a positive attitude about yourself, no matter what circumstances you find yourself in or what kind of history you have. 7 abilities needed to fail forward. Here are 7 abilities of achievers that enable them to fail, not take it personally, and keep moving forward. 1. Achievers reject rejection. Author James Allen states, "A man is literally what he thinks, his character being the complete sum of his thought." That's why it's important to make sure your thinking is on the right track. People who don't give up trying because they don't base their self-worth on their performance. Instead, they have an internally based self-image. Rather than say, "I am a failure," they say, "I missed that one," or "I made a mistake." Psychologist Martin E. Seligman believes that we have 2 choices when we fail. We can either internalize or externalize the failure. People who blame themselves when they fail think they are worthless, talentless, unlovable, says Seligman. People who blame external events do not lose self-esteem when bad events strike. To keep to the right perspective, take responsibility for your actions, but don't take failure personally. 2. Achievers see failure as temporary. People who personalize failure see a problem as a hole they're permanently stuck in, but achievers see any predicament as temporary. For example, take the case of United States President Harry S. Truman. In 1922, he was 38 years old, in debt, and out of work. In 1945, he was the most powerful leader of the free world, occupying the highest office in the land. If he had seen failure as permanent, he would have remained stuck and would have never kept trying and believing in his potential. When achievers fail, they see it as a momentary event, not a lifelong epidemic. 3. Achievers see failures as isolated incidents. Author Leo Buscaglia once talked about his admiration for cooking expert Julia Child. I just loved her attitude, she says. Tonight we're going to make a souffle. And she beats this and whisks that, and she drops things on the floor, and does all these wonderful human things. Then she takes the souffle and throws it into the oven and talks to you for a while. Finally, she says, now it's ready. But when she opens the oven, the souffle just falls flat as a pancake. But does she panic or burst into tears? No, she smiles and says, well, you can't win them all. Bon appetit. When achievers fail, they see it as a momentary event, not a lifelong epidemic. It's not personal. If you want to succeed, don't let any single incident color of your view yourself. 4. Achievers keep expectations realistic. The greater you fear the desire to achieve, the greater the mental preparation required for overcoming obstacles and persevering over the long haul. If you want to take a stroll in the neighborhood, you can reasonably expect to have a few, if any, problems. But that's not the case if you intend to climb Mount Everest. It takes time, effort, and the ability to overcome setbacks. You have to approach every day with the reasonable expectations and not get your feelings hurt when something doesn't turn out perfectly. Something that happened on baseball's opening day in 1954 illustrates the point well. The Milwaukee Braves and the Cincinnati Reds played each other, and a rookie year for each team made his major league debut during that game. The rookie who played for the Reds hit 4 doubles and helped his team win with a score of 9-8. The rookie for the Braves went 0 for 5. The Reds player was Jim Greengrass, a name you probably haven't heard. The other guy who didn't get a hit might be more familiar to him. His name was Hank Aaron, the player who became the best home and run hitter in the history of baseball. Aaron's expectations for the first game were unrealistic. Who knows? He might have gave up baseball. Surely he wasn't happy about his performance that day, but he didn't think of himself as a failure. He worked too hard for too long. He wasn't about to give up easily. 5. Achievers focus on strengths. Another way achievers keep themselves from personalizing failure is by focusing on their strengths. Bob Butera, former president of the New Jersey Devils hockey team, was asked what makes a winner. He answered, what distinguishes winners from losers is that winners concentrate at all times on what they can do, not on what they can't do. If a guy is a great shooter but not a great skater, we tell him to think only about the shot, never about some other guy out skating him. The idea is to remember your successes. If a weakness is a matter of character, It needs much attention. Focus on it until you shore it up. Otherwise, the best bet for failing forward is developing and maximizing your strengths. 6. Achievers vary approaches to achievement. In The Psychology of Achievement, Brian Tracy writes about 4 millionaires who made their fortunes by age 35. They were involved in an average of 17 businesses before finding the one that took them to the top. They kept trying and changing until they found something that worked for them. Achievers are willing to vary their approaches to problems. That's important in every walk of life, not just business. For example, if you're a fan of track and field events, you have undoubtedly enjoyed watching athletes compete in the high jump. I'm always amazed by the heights achieved by the men and women in that event. What's really interesting is, in the 1960s, the sport went through a major change in technique that allowed athletes to break the old records and push them up to new levels. The person responsible for the change was Dick Fosbury, where previous athletes used to straddle method to high jump, in which they went over the bar while facing it, with one arm and one leg leading. Fosbury developed a technique where he went over head first, with his back to the bar. It was dubbed the Fosbury Flop. Developing a new high jump technique was one thing. Getting accepted by others was another matter. Fosbury remarked, "I was told over and over again that I would never be successful, that I was not going to be competitive, and that the technique was simply not going to work. All I could do was shrug and say, 'We'll just have to see.'" And people did. Fosbury won the gold medal in Mexico City Olympics in 1968. He shattered the previous Olympic record and set a new world record in the process. Since then, nearly all world-class high jumpers use this technique. To achieve his goals, Fosbury varied an approach to high jumping, and he didn't allow others' comments to make him feel like a failure. 7. Achievers bounce back. All achievers have in common the ability to bounce back after an error, mistake, or failure. Psychologist Simon Carruthers says, "Life is a series of outcomes. Sometimes the outcome is what you want. Great. Figure out what you did right. Sometimes the outcome is what you don't want. Great. Figure out what you did so you don't do it again." That's the key to bouncing back. Achievers are able to keep moving forward no matter what happens, and that's what's possible because they remember that failure does not make them failures. No one should take mistakes personally. That's the way to take yourself out of the failure. One who refused to be a failure. One of the best stories I've ever heard of someone who refused to take failure personally is that of Daniel Rudy Rudiger, a kid who desperately wanted to play football for Notre Dame. You may have seen the film based on his life called Rudy. It was a good movie, but his real story is even more remarkable and compelling. The first 14 children in a poor working-class family, Rudy loved sports as a kid and believed that it might be his ticket out of Joliet, Illinois. In high school, he gave himself completely to football, but his heart was much greater than his physique. He was slow, and at 5 feet 6 inches tall and 190 pounds, he wasn't exactly built for the game. Rudy's dream. As a senior, he began dreaming about attending Notre Dame and playing football there. But Rudy faced another problem. His grades showed less promise than his physique. "I finished third in my class," he is fond of saying, "not from the top, but from the bottom." He was a D student. He graduated from high school with a 1.77 grade point average. For the next several years, Rudy changed his focus from one thing to another. He tried attending junior college for one semester, but flunked every class. He went to work for 2 years at the local Commonwealth Edison plant in Joliet, what he considered to be the ultimate dead-end job. And he even did a 2-year hitch in the Navy, which turned out to be a turning point for him. That's where he discovered that he wasn't dumb and that he could handle the responsibilities. After military service, he joined a Joliet again and worked in the power plant. He was more determined than ever to go to Notre Dame. Despite the criticism of his family, friends, and co-workers, he knew he was not a failure, and he would find a way to go to South Bend. Making a move. If you saw the movie, then you would know that Rudy eventually made it. He quit his job, moved to South Bend, and managed to get into the Holy Cross College, a community college affiliated with the university. He attended the college for 2 years and earned a 4.0 average in every semester before Notre Dame accepted him. He entered his dream school at age 26, 8 years after graduating from high school. With 2 years of sports eligibility remaining, he went out for football, and he made the team as a scrub, one of the warm bodies they put in practice to keep the good players sharp. But Rudy made the most of it. He worked hard, and after a year he went from the bottom of the scrubs all the way to the 6th string at the top of the scrubs. His last year he worked hard again, and in the final game of his final season, Rudy lived his dream by getting to play. Rudy's last chance. In the movie, Rudy Rudiger gets in for only one play at the end of the game, and he sacks the quarterback, but that's not really how it happened. In real life, I had 2 chances to get the quarterback, says Rudy. The first play, I didn't get there in time. I was too anxious and didn't execute the play. I failed. But once again, Rudy didn't let his failure make him a failure. He was determined to fail forward. I knew this was the last chance I would ever get, he explains. When they snapped the ball, I wasn't worried about failing. I'd done that already, and I knew why I had failed. That's how you eliminate the fear. You keep on learning until you have the confidence to perform, when you have to. When they snapped the ball for the last times, I put the moves I'd rehearsed in my mind, and the guy come over and tell me I got the quarterback. Overjoyed, the team carried him off the field in celebration. Rudy says it's the only time it ever happened to a player in the history of Notre Dame football. Today, Rudy is a motivational speaker, and believe it or not, he was not the force behind the making of the movie Rudy. Of course, it wasn't easy for him. It took him 6 years to see that happen, 2 years later than it took him to get to Notre Dame. The people in Hollywood told him, "You're not Paul Hornung or Joe Montana." Rudy agreed. "There's only one of them," he explained. "There's a million of me." And that's the great thing about Rudy's story. He doesn't have the athletic ability of Michael Jordan, nor is he a genius like Mozart, Van Gogh, Edison, or Einstein. He's just a regular guy, like you or me. The only reason he's an achiever instead of average is that he refused to let failure get the better of him. He learned that no matter how many times you fail, it doesn't have to make you a failure. Your third step to failing forward: remove the you from failure. If you've been thinking of yourself as a failure, you can break yourself out of that negative thinking pattern. Look at an area of your life where you have repeatedly failed and do the following. Examine your expectations for that area. Write them down. Are they realistic? Do you expect to do everything perfectly? Do you expect to succeed on the first try? How many mistakes should you expect to make before you succeed? Adjust your expectations. Find new ways to do your work. Brainstorm at least 20 new approaches, and then try at least half of them. Focus on your strengths. How can you use your best skills and personal strengths to maximize your effort? Vow to bounce back. No matter how many times you fall down, pick yourself up and keep going. Don't wait until you feel positive to move forward. Act your way into feeling good. That's the only way to start thinking more positively about yourself. Steps to failing forward. Realize there is one major difference between average people and achieving people. 2. Learn a new definition of failure. 3. Remove the you from failure. 4. You're too old to cry, but it hurts too much to laugh. Fear makes come true that which one is afraid of. Viktor Frankl. Just about everyone has heard of the Wright brothers, the bicycle mechanics who pioneered man-motorized flight in the part of the 20th century. The circumstances surrounding Orville and Wilbur Wright's first flight on December 17, 1903 make an interesting story. It's certainly a story that illustrates how to fail forward. But what you may not know is that prior to that day, the Wrights, unknown with no university education, were not the leaders in aviation. They were obscure at best, and another man was expected to put the first airplane in the air. His name was Dr. Sam P. Langley. He was a respected former professor of mathematics and astronomy, who at that time was the director of the Smithsonian Institution. Langley was an accomplished thinker, scientist, and inventor. He had published several important works on aerodynamics, and he possessed a vision for achieving manned flight. In fact, in the mid to late 1890s, he had done extensive experiments with large unmanned plane models and achieved a high degree of success. Commissioned to succeed. In 1898, Langley approached the U.S. War Department for funding to design and build an airplane to carry a man aloft. And the department gave him a commission of $50,000, a huge sum at that time. Langley went right to work. By 1901, he had successfully tested an unmanned gasoline-powered, heavier-than-air craft. It was the first in history. And when he enlisted the aid of Charles Manley, an engineer who built a powerful new lightweight engine-based design on the Stephen Balzer, his success seemed inevitable. On October 8, 1903, Langley expected his years of work to come to fruition. As journalists and curious onlookers watched, Charles Manley, wearing a cork-lined jacket, strode across the deck of a modified houseboat and climbed into the pilot's seat of a craft called the Great Aerodrome. This full-size motorized device was perched atop a specially built catapult designed to initiate the aerodrome's flight into the air. But when they attempted to launch the plane, the aerodrome got caught and the biplane was flung into 16 feet of water from a mere 50 yards away from the boat. The criticism of Langley was brutal. For example, this report was read in the New York Times. The ridiculous fiasco which attended the attempt at aerial navigation in the Langley flying machine was not unexpected. The flying machine which will really fly might be evolved by the combined and continuous efforts of mathematicians and mechanics in 1 to 10 million years. No doubt, the problem has its attractions for those it interests, but to ordinary men it would seem as if the effort might be employed more profitably. In the face of failure, at first Langley did not let that failure of the accompanying criticism deter him. 8 weeks later in early December, he and Manley were ready to attempt the flight again. They had made numerous modifications to the aerodrome, and once more Manley climbed into the cockpit from the houseboat deck, ready to make history. But before disaster struck, this time the cable supports to the wings snapped. As the plane was launched, the craft caught again on the launch rail, and it plunged into the river upside down. Manley nearly died. Again, the criticism was fierce. His great aerodrome was called Langley's Folly, and Langley himself was accused of wasting public funds. The New York Times commented, "We hope that Professor Langley will not put his substantial greatness as a scientist in further peril by continuing to waste his time and the money involved in further airship experiments." He didn't. Langley said afterward, "I have brought to a close the portion of the work which seemed to be specially mine, the demonstration of the practicality of mechanical flight. For the next stage, which is the commercial and practical development of the idea, it is probable that the world may look to others." In other words, Langley had given up. Defeated and demoralized, he had abandoned his decades-long pursuit of flight, without ever having seen one of his planes piloted to success. Just days later, Orville and Wilbur Wright, uneducated, unknown, and unfunded, flew their plane, Flyer 1, over the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Two perspectives. Author J.I. Packer states, "A moment of consciousness, triumph, makes one feel that after this nothing will really matter. A moment of realized disaster makes one feel that this is the end of everything. But neither feeling is realistic, for neither event is really what it felt to be." The Wright brothers did not rest on their success. The rush of achievement in that day, December 1903, did not make them think they had arrived. They continued experimenting and working, and eventually the public acknowledged the achievements. In contrast, Langley let his moment of disaster make him think it was the end. He had abandoned his experiments. 2 years later, he suffered a stroke, and a year after that, he died. And today, well, even young school children have heard of the Wright brothers. Langley is remembered by relatively few aviation buffs. When failure gets you by the heart. The first important step in weathering failure is learning not to personalize it. What happened in the life of Samuel Langley occurs in the lives of too many people today. They allow failure to get the better of them emotionally, and it stops them from achieving their dreams. Let's face it, failure can be very painful, sometimes physically and more often emotionally. Seeing part of your vision fall flat really hurts. And if people heap ridicule on top of your hurt feelings, you could feel even worse. The first important step in weathering failure is learning not to personalize it, making sure that your failure does not make you a failure. But there's more to it than that. For many people, the pain of failure leads to fear of failure, and they become like the person who says, "I'm too old to cry, but it hurts too much to laugh." And that's when many people get stuck in the fear cycle. And if fear overcomes you, it's almost impossible to fail forward.